Hello, I'm P. Renada, and today I'm with Professor Herman Kraft, the chairman of the Political Science Department of the University of the Philippines, Diliman. And we're going to talk about the impact of the Joe Biden presidency on the Philippines and the Duterte presidency. So, sir, initial thoughts, sir, on the possibility that Biden might become the next president, and just maybe to start off, like in general, what would be the impact of this new kind of presidency on our country and specifically on the presidency of Duterte?
My suspicion there, no? I mean, if we're focusing, okay, initial thoughts. So, hindi muna yung kay President Duterte, kung ano mo yung initial thoughts. Kasi parang ang ano ko is, my suspicion is that his there are a lot of things that he will have to actually try to fix that might be seen as having been damaged, if you will, by the Trump presidency. You know, this includes relations with other countries, and that includes us. No, but I think one of the things that the Biden White House might actually have to, so we say, prioritize, no, would be the issue of how to try to reach out to basically heal the divisions within American society. So, which means that I suspect that the most important things that a Biden administration might have to focus on initially, no, is actually more internal than anything else. So that means setting up or at least fixing the institutions, right? So that means relations with the Senate, a Senate that looks like it's still going to be dominated by the Republicans, no, and then there's also his problems within his own party, wherein his attempts to actually reach out to the Republicans might not be seen as something that he's the more progressive part of the Democratic Party might not be too happy about, no, and so on. No, so there's going to be a lot of the fixing up, no, that the Biden administration will have to do within the United States itself, no. But what are the implications then as far as foreign relations is concerned, no, especially if you're talking about the Philippines? One of the interesting things, no, is that the Trump administration never really, and I think to a large extent, no, if you will, the Philippines plays a very, very small role within the context of how the United States looks at its foreign relations, no, its foreign policy. And to a large extent, if you're talking about whether it was the Trump administration before or a Biden administration, no, I think the Philippines will not be one of the most important things that a Biden administration might try to fix or try to prioritize, no, especially within its first few months or even the first year. No. However, having said that, there is an issue that is front and center as far as bilateral relations between the Philippines and the U.S. is actually concerned. And that involves the Visiting Forces Agreement, no, and the prospect of President Duterte actually once again pushing for the abrogation, no, the process of abrogation of the LVFA. Now, is that going to be something that's going to be triggered simply because Biden is now the president, no, not Trump anymore? No, I don't think so. I think this is something that the Duterte administration will be very careful about in terms. It's not going to touch this issue willy-nilly. No. On the other hand, no, a Biden administration with a House of Representatives still dominated by the Democrats, even if it has lost some seats. No, I think you'll have an issue, no, wherein Joe Biden will have to deal with the more progressive side of his party in terms of how they might actually want the United States, you know, to react to Duterte, especially as far as human rights is actually concerned. There was already something that happened a few months ago, right? That emanated from the House of Representatives. It didn't push through simply because it wasn't in the interest of the Trump administration to really jack it up, so to speak, right? But what is interesting is that if something similar, no, emanates from the House of Representatives, no, critical of the Duterte administration, especially as far as human rights is concerned, and then President Biden being placed in a situation where he has to actually support it or push it forward, no, And him personally saying something critical about the Duterte administration, that might actually trigger something as far as President Duterte is concerned, and that might actually push the the VFA issue again. No, so in other words, that's the immediate issue as far as Philippine-U.S. relations. No, post Trump, no, with a Biden administration in power, no, that might come up. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be automatically an issue, right? If Joe Biden manages to tamp it down, meaning to say that this is not something that we will touch, precisely because he might have learned from what happened with President Obama before, that they don't say anything about President Duterte, especially his pet peeves, drugs, the CPP-NPA, and so on, human rights, so if President Biden, actually tries to keep these issues, deprioritized, so to speak, meaning to say that his administration doesn't do anything about it, then I think this is something that might allow space wherein Biden can try to actually build some sort of relationship, with the Duterte administration, right? Meaning to say that the problem here is that you still have 2 years of Duterte, right? And so within that time, there are a lot of things that could actually happen, especially if you're looking at the triangle between the Philippines, the United States, and China, right? So in that context, I think one of the things that his advisors might actually be telling him, President Biden, would be, let's try to moderate, any statements, that might be deemed as being critical of the Duterte administration, which would be so easy for a democratic administration to actually do, precisely because of how the Democrats actually identify themselves. Now, of course, like I said, the problem that he has is I don't see this as being a top priority for the House of Representatives in the United States, but at the same time, it becomes a question of his relationship, like I said, with the progressive wing, of the Democratic Party, especially those who are actually in the Democratic caucus in the House of Representatives.
Mm-hmm. What makes you think that a President Biden would have learned from Obama's lesson? Like he would see that as parang proof that he should be more cautious with Duterte. Do you think that that it's also likely that he would be more aggressive than Obama, or you think Biden is more of a moderate in that sense?
It's not that he's more moderate or more aggressive. No, it's more of the directions of American foreign policy. Remember, one of the things that the Trump administration actually did was damage U.S. relations with very close allies, and friends, not just in the Asia Pacific region, but I think more specifically relations with its allies in Europe, right? So, in other words, generally speaking, one of the things that a Biden administration might be careful about, or might want to do, is to rebuild those relationships, right? And in that sense, while the Philippines doesn't exactly fall within a category wherein our relationship with the United States was damaged by the Trump administration, I think it's the reverse, right? But when Obama was still in power, relations between the Philippines and the U.S. actually just went down. But when Trump acceded to the presidency, the personal relationship between Trump and President Duterte, managed to stem whatever inclination President Duterte might have had in terms of really moving the Philippines away from the United States, right? So that's why even as President Duterte might prefer closer ties with China at the expense of relations with the U.S., somehow we've managed to keep our relationship with the United States at a more or less normal condition. I think a Biden presidency would not want to do anything to rock the boat as far as any relationship with any of its friends and allies is concerned. So that means he's going to be very, very careful, as far as as far as the Philippines is concerned, which might moderate any action statement on his part, no, as far as Duterte's policies on human rights, no, drugs, no, and all of these things might be concerned. He certainly would be very careful about driving or creating the conditions where President Duterte might find it or might give President Duterte, no, the rationale, the reason, no, for why he can proceed with his inclination to really put the Philippines closer to China, no, and move it away from the United States. So that's one thing that I think the advisors of President Biden might actually be talking about, no, as far as the relationship with the Philippines is concerned. Like I said, this is not something that's going to erupt within the first few months. The Philippines is not a priority as far as the United States is concerned, regardless of which administration is actually going to be sitting there after these elections.
So parang my understanding of your analysis is it kind of tempers expectations of people na just because we have a Democrat na president versus a Republican like Trump, that suddenly like this president will go all out against Duterte. So parang you're saying that may not necessarily be the case.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think beyond the ideological issues, no, in terms of criticisms that the Duterte administration might merit because of its policies, no, on issues where the Democratic Party might actually have a real interest in, no. There are also geopolitical considerations, no, that I think the Biden administration that would temper, no, the Biden administration's approach to what the more progressive wing in the Democratic Party might actually want to push, no, as far as the Duterte administration is concerned.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier China, no, and everyone's eyes are on that. Like, what will Biden do about the China factor? And we know that Duterte has been leaning towards China in recent years, and also that we've also witnessed how the Trump administration naman wasn't so actually came to the defense of the Philippines in many instances. Like, for example, declaring that any attack on Scarborough Shoal will trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. So those kinds of pronouncements from the Trump government kind of emboldened, or parang it's a little bit of a plus side for us, especially when it comes to our claims against China and our claims in our stake in the West Philippine Sea. So how do you think this foreign policy will change under Biden?
I don't think that it's going to change much. Although my suspicion is that Biden might actually temper the more confrontational approach that the Trump administration took as far as China is concerned. No, but if you'll notice, no, what's interesting about that confrontational approach, no, is that personally speaking, no, President Trump was actually interested in trade, right, in economic relations with China, right? So in other words, he was critical of China's industrial espionage, no, and how China's dominance in electronics, for instance, might actually translate into national security problem for the United States, no, and so on. But he has never really said anything as far as the geopolitical conditions, no, in the Asia Pacific region is concerned. He's not really interested in that. No, on that aspect, you have to go to Pompeo, for instance, no, to Secretary of State Pompeo, or the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, for instance, to be able to find what is it that what's the policy of the United States as far as these things are actually concerned. Yes, the Trump administration never said anything as far as Scarborough Shoal, West Philippine Sea, South China Sea is concerned. No, he never even said anything about about Japan and China, for instance, right? His main concern as far as China was concerned was always on the economic side of things, not on the trade issue, right? So that he talked about sanctions, the negotiations was about trade relations and so on, right? The question here is how will Biden actually, what is it that a Biden administration would actually temper or moderate, if you will? Will it moderate anything as far as the Trump administration or the approach taken by the Trump administration is concerned? I think one of the things that, like I said earlier, one of the things that a Biden administration would prioritize would be to rebuild ties, right? So the relationship with South Korea, the relationship with China, no, and then certainly strengthening the defense and security instruments that they were actually trying to build before, the Quad, no, and all of these things. They might actually be much more active in ASEAN-led multilateral arrangements like the East Asia Forum, the East Asia Summit, for instance, right? In an attempt to rebuild the security architecture, that maintained stability and security around this part of the world. But let's not kid around. The priority of the United States, regardless of whether you're talking about a Trump administration or a Biden administration, as far as this part of the world is concerned, is going to be China, right? And one of the things that a Biden administration will not be able to avoid is recognizing that China has become a strategic competitor, right? And as a strategic competitor, that means that the United States has to build a coalition, that would allow it to manage China's activities, around the region, whether you're talking about it in terms of China's attempts to dominate the economic environment, or you're talking about China's activities as far as militarizing and dominating the South China Sea. So in other words, these are things that the United States could continue to actually do, whether it's Trump or Biden, right? But at the same time, I think Biden's not going. Like I said, I don't think that Biden is going to immediately confront China in a way that's similar to how Trump actually approached the bilateral relations between China and the United States.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So siguro last na lang, sir, yung just the maybe a lighter side of things, their personalities. Sure. Because like you said, si Trump was very strong on the trade war with China. He was very tough on things like their 5G network, Huawei.
Yeah.
Marami siyang allegations about that. So though Biden is not the same person, obviously, and will take a more moderate approach, it does say in his platform that he will crack down on economic abuses by China and other parties. So how do you think this kind of approach to China would affect naman the Philippine economy and, Philippine businesses, since we're so dependent also on China's economy?
That's right. No, but I think that's an important point, because the Philippines actually did not benefit from the sanctions that was imposed by the United States under Trump on China. Yes, you did have some businesses that actually left China, but they didn't come to the Philippines. They went to Indonesia, they went to Vietnam. Taiwanese companies went back to Taiwan, for instance. In other words, there was very little. Hindi tayo naambunan nung nangyari na yon. And in fact, the other thing that's actually quite interesting is with the Trump administration. One of the things that I think affected us was their drive to actually bring back jobs to the United States, right? And I think to a certain extent you could see that in terms of how the BPO industry in the Philippines has not really expanded. From the time that Trump came to power, the BPO industry in the Philippines was always the one that was actually driving Philippine growth, to a large extent. Malaking bagay yung yan, especially in terms of employment. But it never really expanded, right? Parang in terms of the first few years when Trump was actually pushing American companies to actually hire Americans to stay in the United States, one of the consequences of that was actually walang masyado expansion on ng BPO industry dito sa Pilipinas. And then eventually later on, especially nung biglang nag-contract yung under COVID, and all of these other things, quite a few positions, basically nag-contract din yung BPO industry dito sa Pilipinas. Parang that was one of the consequences of that. So, can we expect something beneficial with Biden in power? I don't think so, because he will be he will still be continuing this confrontation with China, perhaps, with a lot less heated rhetoric behind it. No, he's going to use friends and allies, try to rebuild the kinds of institutions that we had in the region, as an instrument for how to soften the approach, to China. So, but it doesn't mean that they're going to ratchet it down. No, it's still going to be there. They're going to be confronting China. The security aspects will still be there, and so on. No, but is that going to benefit the Philippines at all? In much the same way that Trump's approach did not benefit us, I don't think that this is in any way at all going to be beneficial to us. Now, the danger there, of course, is unless there is a rebuilding, because I think the most consequential thing about the Trump administration as far as the Philippines is concerned, was the idea of trying to keep investments in the United States, right? So, yun ang nagkaroon ng epekto sa atin, no? As far as China is concerned, well, you don't see a contraction in the Chinese economy because of what the Americans have done. In fact, parang, diba, China is the only country in the major economy in the Asia Pacific region that whose economy will actually be seen as growing, no matter how small it might be, amidst the pandemic, right? So, which means that parang what we might be facing is that if an expansion of American interests in the Philippines is actually concerned, is not going to happen, then the Chinese and Duterte's interest in building up China's involvement in the Philippines, might actually be given a pathway, so to speak, right? I think there was an interview earlier where I heard John Forbes, of the Philippine American Business Council or whatever it was, was saying that one of the things that American long-term American businessmen in the Philippines actually interested in, is a free trade agreement between the Philippines and the United States, right? Whether this is done multilaterally, or I think he was talking in terms of a bilateral arrangement, but that's one thing that they're very, very interested in. The problem, of course, is that I'm not too sure to what extent President Duterte might be interested in it, right? That bilateral FTA with the United States. I'm sure that if we actually showed any interest in it, a Biden administration would be interested in trying to pursue it. But at this point, the same reasons that kept that FTA from actually progressing, still are in place right now. Meaning to say that the Duterte administration has not really shown any inclination to push this, aggressively. So, no, I don't see any benefits accruing from the way that Biden might actually choose to approach relations with China, compared to how the Trump administration did it. The only thing that I'm certain of, is that a ratcheting down of the rhetoric and the accusations, would at least make sure that we're not going to see a trade war between China and the United States, escalating, which would be very, very damaging for all economies around the region. That's going to be very, very bad for us as well.
So do you think Biden is inclined to continue with Trump's plan or parang program of sorts to keep American jobs in America and make sure that American companies stay in America?
That goes back to the point I was making about the priority of any administration following the Trump administration, would be to try to heal the divisions, right? Especially with the Biden administration, right? And ang problema dito is that those are precisely the things that Trump's supporters liked about Trump. The idea of keeping jobs in the United States, that American companies should be investing in the U.S., not outside, that the U.S. government is spending too much of the taxpayers' money in assistance to other countries, when inside the United States you have people who require that kind of attention as well. So in other words, he may not be inclined to actually follow that particular policy of Trump, no, especially when it comes to immigration, no, and those things. And remember, Biden was part of an administration that believed in multilateralism, that believed in international trade, no, and in globalization, right? So, kumbaga, in fact, the interesting thing is the Republican Party is not an isolationist party, right? It's only Donald Trump, no, in pushing his campaign for the presidency before, no, which made this an essential part of the platform of the Republican Party. No, but both the Democrats and the Republicans, no, were in favor of expanded international trade, no, and a liberal trading regime. No, so Biden, I think, hasn't changed as far as that is actually concerned. He wants a much more liberal economic order in place. No, he will try to rebuild that. But then again, I don't think that he's going to push that too hard, precisely because he needs to court, if you will, not to woo, no, Trump supporters who believe that the Democrats are just going to, leave them behind again. Yeah, basically take their jobs again. Yeah.
There are many similarities between Duterte and Biden. Like, for one thing, they're both septuagenarians. They're both one of the older presidents of their countries. So, like, can you see them getting along, or how do you see their dynamics in terms of personalities?
Honestly speaking, no. um, uh, and I think it's because, look, one of the things that's always been said about Biden, right, is he's empathetic, meaning to say that he, at a personal level, no, it's easy for him to empathize with the conditions that people might actually be facing. No, that's not exactly a characterization of our own president, right? That you could actually lay out. No, does that make them very different? Yes, it makes them very different, no, personality-wise. Does that mean that they're actually not going to like each other? I think the problem there is not so much their personalities, right? But more of their the ideological positions that they actually hold, right? But at a personal level, I guess this is the question you're asking, right? At a personal level, will they like each other? Will they get along? Um, Obama was a very serious person, right? And that's he took himself seriously, and that might have been one of the reasons why he wasn't exactly enamored, or that there was a clash of personalities between him and President Duterte. I don't think that Biden will fall under that, or will be as shall we say, serious in how he takes himself, no, in terms of how he relates to President Duterte. But at the same time, I don't think that there's going to be any interest on the part of Joe Biden to actually build a personal relationship with President Duterte, which is interesting because what I'm saying is that if you look at the Duterte-Trump bromance, if you will, well, it's not exactly a bromance, right? But the personal relationship between them, that's all there is, right? There's nothing substantial about the relationship, or at least in terms of how that personal relationship between Trump and Duterte has translated into policy, that Trump actually pushes forward, as far as the Philippines is concerned. Like I said, to a large extent, as far as the Philippines is concerned, Trump left these things to others, right? So Pompeo, Singpak, and so on, right? He never said anything as far as the substantive element, in Philippine-U.S. relations is concerned. As far as is concerned, the Philippines was Rodi Duterte. That's all. It's the personal relationship between them. I don't think that you're going to find Biden trying to build that kind of relationship as well. And neither do I think that Duterte is actually interested in building that relationship. Right? Remember, he advised Phil Ams to vote for Donald Trump, right? In these elections, right? So that already indicates that he has some reservations, about Biden, and the kind of relationship the U.S. and the Philippines might actually have if Biden becomes president, right? So no, I don't think that their personalities will make them gel or find common grounds, a common ground in the same way that Donald Trump and President Duterte actually clicked, at a personal level.
So that was our discussion with Professor Herman Kraft about the impact of the Joe Biden presidency on the Philippines and Duterte presidency. I'm Pierre Nado once again. Thank you for watching Rappler Talk.